Thank you, World Forum Disrupt, for having me moderate yet another panel. This has been a great series so far over the past 6 months. I think this is my 5th panel so far. And today, as Max noted, we're going to be talking about containers, adoption of containers, trends, best practices, what we're seeing in the marketplace. I suspect that we'll probably delve into some peripheral areas like microservices, serverless, and the like as well. Or at least I'll try to prod some of our panelists to comment on those as well as we see fit. To begin, let's do a round of introductions. When I call your name, please give your name, title, who you work for, maybe location, okay? So Andrew, let's start with you.
Hi, my name is Andriy Zhylenko, CEO of Porto. The company is based in Vancouver, Canada. I'm now connecting from Barcelona, Spain. We are dealing with telco applications, and we have labor's task of making this very conservative crowd of telco people to go into the cloud, adopt containers, adopt microservices.
Thank you. Valentina.
Hello, my name is Valentina Alaria. I'm a director of product management at VMware. I focus on building a very compelling developer experience for companies that are moving to Kubernetes, whether that's on private or public cloud. And helping overcome some of the challenges a lot of companies are facing in this move. So happy to be here today.
Oh, thank you for being here. Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Hahn, and I'm Director of Cloud Strategies and DevOps for Cyber Global. So I help my consulting teams throughout the US and India with cloud adoption and with using containers and containers on Kubernetes or other container orchestration platforms. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And Rahul.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rahul Subramaniam. I'm the CEO at DevFactory and Engineered. Engineered is basically a company that provides an easy way of hosting and deploying your container workloads without having to get into the nitty-gritty details of how to manage Kubernetes clusters. So, yep, look forward to the panel today.
I think it's going to be great. Thanks, Rahul. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So as we said at the outset, I mean, containers has been a hot topic in my mind, probably for the past couple of years, right? So as people are looking at deploying new applications to containers or considering whether or not containers is really the best design or infrastructure paradigm for themselves, they have a myriad of questions, especially around orchestration, security, development lifecycle, and the like. And again, as I stated before, I'd like to hear more about some of the next levels of abstraction, like serverless, microservices, function as a service, and the like. So I'm going to throw the first question out to the panel, and if somebody could grab this one, let's start to it. The first question I have is, what are the top trends that we're seeing right now in terms of container adoption across the board?
So I think that a lot of that has to do with the viability of Kubernetes and the fact that a lot of companies have heard about Kubernetes and have tried to move to that because they see the benefits that Kubernetes offers and they're trying to take advantage of it. So I think that's sort of number one that's out there, is that people are moving to the cloud, moving to more I guess, easier platforms or platforms that give them more agility to deliver software. So they're finding that containers are a part of that process, and just using containers alone is helpful. But if they can use containers with an orchestration platform, or even some of the platforms that are on the cloud providers, such as Fargate or the Azure Container Service, they're getting the ability to deliver software faster. So lots of people are looking for that to try and realize those benefits.
So, you bring up an interesting point. I think when we talk about orchestration of containers, Mark, everybody instantly gravitates towards Kubernetes, right? It's kind of I'd say the 800-pound elephant in the room when it comes to orchestration. Okay. What of this platform, right? Because there's been other orchestration platforms or quasi orchestration platforms out there. What does Kubernetes have that any of the other incumbents or contenders don't? Is there any differentiation in this orchestration platform? Any comments from the panel there?
Yeah, so about 4 or 5 years ago, when containers started kind of coming to the fore, you had a number of players, and at that particular point of time, it was very uncertain which orchestration platform to kind of put your bets on. You had Mesos, you had Docker, and they were starting to work on Swarm, and Swarm was starting to, given that everything kind of started from Docker being the container, engine from there, starting to create an orchestration platform with Swarm. So Mesos, Swarm, Kubernetes was also kind of starting to pick up, and so it was very the cloud providers like Amazon started with ECS. So it was really hard to pick pick which orchestration platform to be on. But I think what has evolved over the last 2 years at least is that I think Kubernetes has kind of won that race, and everyone is betting on Kubernetes primarily because it's open, it is vendor neutral. Pretty much all the big cloud providers have adopted it as their core orchestration platform for even their native, managed services that they offer. And the likes of on-prem system providers like Red Hat and IBM have also, started adopting Kubernetes as, one of the core fundamental services that they offer as part of their stacks. So I think it's kind of gained this universal acceptance as the standard, and the momentum that has now picked up around Kubernetes with all the CRDs and all the different, extensions that are happening on the platform. I think it's become an ecosystem that's kind of self-sustaining at this point, which a lot of the other platforms don't have today.
Which is surprising, right? Because I thought at the outset, Docker and Docker Swarm would have been the clear winner because they were kind of the first name you thought of when containers started coming into the vernacular, right? In terms of our industry. So great insight as well there, Rahul. Another good question. How about pros and cons of adopting containers by themselves, right? So we've been in this virtualization paradigm for many, many years, and all of a sudden containerization is now out there. It seems like there's some clear pros, obviously, towards adopting these as opposed to, bare metal virtualization or otherwise. Are there any other pros other than the further abstraction layers, or are there some obvious cons that we might come across in terms of adopting containers?
Maybe I can provide a perspective in terms of not just from a technology perspective, but what are some of the challenges maybe that organizations face as they look at containers, right? And I think it has less to do again to the technology per se, which at this point has been maturing quite a bit, and is something that it's pretty widely understood. But it's really a transformation of a lot of the practices and tooling that organizations historically have in place and now need to sort of transform and adapt to this new model. So Mark earlier was talking about it's not just about the orchestration piece, but it's actually about a lot of the things that surround it, and particularly if you think about sort of like the tooling and how you sort of bring an application from ideation to production. There's a lot of interesting, opportunities there for organizations to bring in a lot of that, fantastic ecosystem that it's been emerging over these years around Kubernetes and containers more in general. But it is a transformation, right? I mean, what is a YAML? How do I deal with charts? These are all new models that can feel pretty scary. And so, adopting containers may seem like it is, probably a clear win, and it's very often a top-down mandate for these organizations, but there's still a bit of a gap that we can help sort of fulfill there.
I think there are two, Andrew, go ahead.
And I would argue that just saying adopting containerization, that's a word in which already puts you on the wrong track. Because it's like saying, I want to adopt an internal combustion engine, right? It's a great technology, but the engine itself, you cannot drive it. You cannot navigate. You don't know what to do with it. So the containers, yes, it's a great way for us to make portable code. But any more or less complex application, you have to start thinking about, okay, how are you going to do the deployment? How are you going to do configuration management? And I would say that right now, we're in the situation, and I've seen it in many companies, when DevOps and the people who actually manage the release engineering and deployments, they cannot keep up with developers like churning out those containers. So it's almost like feels like when they had to change keyboards, so the operators they were typing too fast for the network to carry out the messages. It almost like feels like the developers are doing their development too fast for people. If they don't have the right tools to deploy it and do CI/CD, they're just overwhelmed. So I don't know what would be the proper name for this, but it has to be the whole vertical thing. So if you start adopting the containers, you have to start thinking right away, okay, how are we going to assemble it together? How are we going to provision it? How are we going to manage the configuration which runs on like deployments, on staging, on acceptance, on production in different environments? And how we're not going to go crazy about it?
I think there's one other difference that a lot of folks miss, which is fundamentally containers is a little different of a paradigm. I think most people try to associate it with VMs or try to draw parallels with VMs, and it is not that. It is fundamentally different. And so there are a lot of things you have to unlearn from your traditional deployment on premise or in a data center kind of setup that you had before, where you deployed physically on bare metal servers or on VMs if you went down that route. And you really need to take care of a few things at its root. Things like, how is your state being managed? Is it a stateful service? Is it non-stateful? A lot of people try to move stateful workloads over to containers. And while, okay, if you just got one machine with one container running on it, great, that's fine. But if you really want to leverage containers for how they were designed to be, like scaling up, scaling down, those kind of operations, there are a lot of things you have to take care of to comply with the paradigm, which I think is a challenge for most who come from the traditional development model of more traditional monolithic apps.
Yeah, I agree. And what we're finding is that a lot of the development frameworks are now adopting to that stateless, stateful model, so that you can build front ends that are stateless and rely on back ends that provide that state. And so you have to bring the rest of your development ecosystem to that model. So you've got to retrain your developers a little bit. You've got to retrain operations to deal with it. So it's really, and going to, I think, Valentina's point, it's about this whole developer ecosystem, and your silos, the service silos that you had before in a legacy environment change. And so those job responsibilities change a bit. And that's what is, kind of part and parcel of this container adoption, is to also change your practices for delivering software.
Yeah. So, the other kind of assumption I'm thinking about when I'm hearing some of the answers here is that folks already have a solid and mature CI/CD infrastructure when they are thinking about containers, and maybe some of them don't. Are there any other considerations for those that are saying, you know what, we're not even sure that we have the proper value chain development lifecycle to get to containerization, to get to some of these other paradigms, stateless, stateful? Are there any other any other considerations from an application development perspective, more specifically?
I think I'd add one other thing, which is a lot of folks get into containerization of their apps with this notion that they're going to convert or refactor their entire applications into a microservice, specifically if they started off as a monolith. And in their heads, they kind of go too far in breaking stuff down into microservices. And I think that's one of the big things to kind of avoid, or that shouldn't be your primary driver. If I were to kind of give a few pieces of simple advice to anyone to explore container, I'd say, if you want your traditional application to be portable, start with containerization. Second is, if your product is really old and you're afraid that your entire stack that builds up your product is a big black box. Like I remember, about a decade ago, I had a product where the VM, there was only one VM on which you could build the product because all the dependencies were on that one VM. And if you didn't have that VM or a copy of that VM, you really couldn't do any development. And if you are in a state like that, you really want to reconstruct your entire stack from scratch, keep it maintainable, manage it all in one place, and keep it lightweight. Containers are a great way to do that and distribute it. Because you just have your Docker file that you need to kind of move around, and it's straightforward. So if those are your motivations starting from a monolith environment, I think that's great. If you're trying to go down a huge microservices path and you imagine that to be this dream world or your fantasy land where it'll solve to start with to get into containers.
So yeah, I think, obviously everybody thinks about microservices, function as a service, whatever, as being the ultimate, Rosetta Stone to where everybody wants to go. But I think, in terms of these areas as well, you have to think about, and this came up on another panel I was on, data storage, data governance, provenance, and things like that. When you're in a very highly ephemeral environment, how do you account for these things, especially, with these new regulations coming down? So that's an interesting kind of insight as well. Any other pros and cons to containers? And another question I might have is, basically, Rahul kind of jumped ahead of where I was going to go, but do we see folks now saying, you know what, we've been using containers for a year or so. Microservices does look like the next logical abstraction to go to. Could we see in a couple of years the shift now go away from containers into microservices? Rahul laid out a great point why you shouldn't, but is there any reason why we might want to go, or any other pitfalls around that?
Go
ahead, Andrew.
Communicating with developers, I see one of it's a typical challenge, and I think that has been around for years. I remember in mid-90s, I was given a training on the case tools, that's computer-assisted engineering, and I was told, okay, in a few years, we'll not really need developers. It's just going to be all kind of automated. It'll be just drag and drop in. And so every 5 years or so, we have this new silver bullet coming out, supposed to be changing things. And the worst thing which could happen, it's if your CTO and enough developers will say, okay, we're going to forget about this old application. We're going to build this new thing from scratch. We're going to build it properly. And it's a lot of fun for developers. That's what they love to do. I'm a developer myself. I know it's fun. The thing is, we all know software projects, they typically take about 3 times longer than they're supposed to, a much larger budget. So usually you cannot afford having your cash cow application, something that you have live customers, you're supposed to be helping them, to kind of abandon them and for a couple of years just sit in a garage and come up and work on the perfect solution. So something which we've seen people adopting successfully, we had a few customers of ourselves doing this. It's before you get to this perfect version where this microservices or some AI building code. Okay, first, again, you build this pipeline of gradual migrations. So what we're doing now is, okay, this is your old version. This is your a bit better version. Next year is going to be gradual evolution. So let's put agile process of moving customers in small batches, transparent to them. So by then, your customers, they don't notice anything. And the most important thing, your team is used to this constant evolution. Like this mentality, DevOps mentality, you have also to apply to sales and marketing people. You have to tell them, okay, we're going to be doing this small updates over years. No, we're not going to wait 2 years and do this RFP for doing this major change. Let's make sure we work in an agile way. And this helps with technology. So even if at a certain point we make a wrong turn on the technology side, well, then it's just one sprint, one iteration, we can go back on track. So it's not like spending years of developing something which maybe using the wrong orchestration technology, which is now obsolete, and they have to move everything to Kubernetes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the more we overpromise to the business side, so to speak, right? I think it's tough enough to kind of move to the left in terms of figuring out vulnerabilities in these new areas. And we're overpromising already, that we can move faster and faster and faster, which is great. especially from a production delivery perspective, but what are the downstream impacts to that? I think you've laid it out very well, Andrew, and thank you. So another question, how about some best practices? And from not only container adoption, but Valentina, I'm wondering, you're dealing with Kubernetes a lot. Any best practices around, if you haven't used Kubernetes yet, adoption, maintenance, or ongoing use of Kubernetes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think something that we're seeing emerging pretty consistently across the board is that a lot of customers that start thinking about Kubernetes start thinking about like one big cluster that is probably going to be divided across multiple teams. And then very soon you find yourself with a very large number of Kubernetes clusters. And so, whatever solution, and there's a very large number of such solutions out there, but sort of establishing a multi-cluster management layer that allows you to very consistently have visibility, control, ability to apply policies, access, control policies, and much more than that across this fleet of clusters becomes pretty critical from the get-go. And then, of course, establishing a way to secure these clusters, because one of the interesting things is that if you go out there and start scanning Kubernetes clusters, the very vast majority is just wide open. Service accounts can be created and, the likes, and that's actually a pretty big vulnerability, right? So leveraging, and again, like this consistent layer of management to provision policies automatically, making sure that all the clusters are secured, that you can control who can access these clusters, how they can access it, and so on and so forth. And from there on, day two operations, right? So what is your observability strategy? How you're gonna, actually gain visibility to this layer? And how you're going to start offering this on demand to different portions of your organization. Because one of the reasons why a lot of organizations move to Kubernetes and container as a service is so that they can allow developers to self-service provision their environments. And so there's also interesting things that can be established there to make sure that once your environment is properly secured, you can start chunking it up and offering to developers with some way of protecting different environments, establishing best practices around dev, which has to be, nimble, fast, and then moving all the way to prod with more of a strict DevOps tooling and practice that is established there. So that's certainly what we see as part of our interactions.
That's great insights. One point that you brought up, Valentina, about observability. What natively within Kubernetes, is there any ability to enhance your observability in the cluster? And if not, are there any other areas or any other tools that might be openly available that can assist? Somebody may not be, very familiar with what to look for, how often to monitor these clusters and the like.
Yeah, maybe I can start and then everyone else please jump in. But
yep.
The good thing about the ecosystem is that, there is something for every area that you may need. And it's also why it's a bit overwhelming, but there is a lot of things that exist there to help you with observability. So you have your, Fluentd, Fluentbit type of things. And then you have your, Prometheus and Grafana and the combination, and then all these open tracing, protocols that have been established. And so the combination of sort of like these three things constitute what often the Kubernetes industry refers to as observability. Now, all of those have, open API that can then be plugged into a lot of the industry standard, login, monitoring, tracing tooling that organizations already have. And so that's part of a bit of that, do it yourself or pay someone to help you with integration that it's often needed for the large organizations to then plug these systems into their environment. But that all exists there. I think, James, you mentioned something before, which is really critical here, though, is a lot of these new paradigms like functions and serverless and such tend to be very ephemeral in nature, and so that's for example, login. If a pod disappears, your logs will just disappear with it. And so there is a lot of interesting opportunities again to help organizations make sense of these environments, like where just traditional login strategies will not cut it.
So the ecosystem does provide a bunch of these tools, and the good news is, I think while there are lots of choices, many of those choices are right. So you don't have to follow the same path as your neighbor, right? There is no one specific choice that is exactly right. And there's lots of advice out there in sort of solving these problems. How do you your logs are ephemeral on a pod and disappear when the pod disappears, and you want those pods to go away on a regular basis. So there are, lots of tools that can help you do that log shipping and move it to a centralized position. And whether you're building the cluster and your container environment yourselves, or you're relying on, say, a cloud provider or so forth. So there are a number of opinionated environments that help you. So Red Hat's got OpenShift, Google has got Anthos, and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity here to take advantage of the ecosystem and your partners to give you help in this area. So they do a lot to help with this set of best practices and set of opinions that help you to developer productivity and to improve that value stream, because you're really using this to drive business value. So, leverage your partners to help you get to a set of processes that deliver that business value.
Yeah. Rahul, how about your views on observability?
Before I do observability, I want to combine something that Mark and both Valentina said and put it in a package of the 101 class. Step number one is to understand that Kubernetes is incredibly hard and can get as expensive as you want, depending on how much you want to invest in managing massive teams to handle every aspect of it. Observability is one piece of it. Just configuring and managing your entire environment is crazy hard. Keeping it up and running, scaling it up. Most folks try one container on a cluster and think, oh, I've got it. Let me go now, put it, try to roll this out at a larger scale. But as you grow, as you start looking at, okay, I've got to have storage attached to it. How do I get storage to my containers? How do I, put different kinds of data in different places? Like, how do I, put certain workloads on certain kinds of machines? It starts getting incredibly complex, and most people don't grasp that enough. So back to what Valentina was saying, use a management layer on top. There are enough and more services out there, managed services, that take care of a lot of that headache for you, and they give you a simple abstraction to go deal with these environments. And I would highly recommend someone to go do that rather than trying to get your hands dirty. Like, unless that's core to your business, where you really need to be at the Kubernetes layer, I'd say don't waste your time and money at that layer. There are enough abstractions now on top of that layer to simplify your world, right? And there are different flavors, like back to what Mark said, there are different answers for different use cases. And again, there are enough and more solutions out there that will help you solve your particular kind of problem. I think in 90% of the cases that holds. The other thing that most people kind of start off with Kubernetes and containers is thinking, oh, the resource utilization is going to be far better when I move to containers. And that is true. You can actually have much higher resource utilization of your infrastructure if you move to containers. But the caveat there is you lose track of all the other expenses around managing these resources, and the kind of DevOps teams you'll need, the observability that you'll have to go build out. You kind of lose track of that. So I'd recommend, again, back to my 101 class, go with a managed service that takes care of a lot of this stuff for you. There are services out there where your logging, your traceability, your management of container deployments, your management of the cluster, scaling, all are built for you. The traceability is available to you. Observability is available to you. You don't have to go build stuff yourself. You can focus on building your product, and all of this comes for free. And that way you also get much better, cost advantages. So do not try to invent all this stuff yourself from scratch would be I think my number one advice when it comes to Kubernetes.
So before I ask Andriy his views, I have a counter question there, Rahul. So we talk about traceability, and I think about traceability not just from a performance perspective, but from an audit, forensics perspective, et cetera. How do you do that in that? Are there any tools, or are there any best practices? Say you have some kind of an incident, but it's in a container environment which is changing so rapidly and may be very difficult or near impossible to get the information we need to do an incident check or forensic analysis.
Yeah, so typically a system like Kubernetes needs to offload or basically start, fire hosing all of the events out to external systems that are persistent. So if you, for example, you were in an AWS-like environment, you'd basically use X-Ray and CloudWatch and CloudTrail to make sure that all of the events are being captured and you have traceability around that. CloudWatch is basically primarily what you'll use for traceability. X-Ray for understanding what's happening with each of your call out to any service within Kubernetes, for example. But similar setups can be replicated across all foreseeable environments. On-prem, you've got tools to do that. In different cloud providers, you have other tools to do that. If you want something really robust and something that you can just kind of fire and forget, I'd again say managed services for Kubernetes with direct built-in plugins to traceability and observability tools is what I would recommend. At Engineered, for example, we rely very heavily on X-Ray and X-Ray, Prometheus, Grafana, CloudWatch to get a lot of these insights into traceability and observability that's just built into the platform, where you don't have to build it yourself or manage it.
Great. No, that's great insight and great recommendation on those AWS native tools. Fantastic. Andrew, any insights on observability? And then we have a question from the attendees.
I just would like to add that right now, the state of development and with containers, it's like Wild West, or I used to live in Seattle. It's like Seattle in the early 20th century. There's a lot of people, a lot of enthusiasm, but as so many messy things. And then if you ever did like underground tour in Seattle, all these amazing stories. So, but now we're getting there when it's your choice. Either you will be thinking ahead and applying some of those practices, and yes, either go and manage services or thinking about this design, or you will be like getting very, very useful, but also very painful experience on your own network or on your own Kubernetes. And so, yeah, so I think it's time to get more civilized and to put some city planning and do coordination between teams.
Excellent. All right. I think we covered that. There was one question from the audience, and I'm going to leave this open for the panel. They're asking if on thoughts of any specific security challenges they've encountered with respect to either Kubernetes, containerization, or these abstraction layers.
Maybe I'll kick it off. I did touch on one, which is just poor best practice, and poor best practice multiplied times 1,000 when things start to scale very easily. The other thing it's somewhat related, which is as you start having a large number of containers, as you think about microservices and running a large number of pods, whenever a CVE emerges or any need for sort of applying a security patch consistently across the environment, that again starts to prove being a pretty consistent challenge. So just sort of like looking at tooling that will automatically help you apply the patch and rebuild and so on and so forth become pretty imperative in these environments. And then there's a gazillion more. Maybe I'll just leave someone else the pleasure to talk about secrets and the likes.
Secrets management, that's another one. Mark, any insight on that?
Well, yes. I mean, in the Kubernetes environment, that you've got a secrets manager, and then there are a bunch of other tools that you can use to manage your secrets. But you want to think about this secrets management sort of end to end in terms of the whole life cycle for the secrets that you create, and think about it. And so as you're coming into this, you really want to do some threat modeling around not just your applications, but your processes for deploying those applications. You want to be able to use automation to deliver reasonably fast, and that helps you because you're developing and delivering your applications quickly. You should be able to include changes. So if you've got CVEs in the libraries that you're working, or security vulnerabilities in your software supply chain that you use, you can quickly rebuild your application with the newest versions that have patched and push those out. And by being able to use that automation, it's very easy for you to update your software and update the parts and pieces on your cluster. And to do that, though, you need to be able to deploy those, not just those pods, but as well as everything, the credentials that they need to go forward. So there are a number of different approaches to credential management, but Kubernetes comes with some pretty good tools that can be combined with other tools that are out there. HashiCorp Vault is probably one of the premier tools for that. If you're using a cloud native provider, many of those cloud native systems come with secret tooling that you can use in Credential Manager in AWS and Vault in Azure Vault in the Azure environment. That can be combined with the clusters that you're deploying to very easily deliver those secrets in a very secure way to your application. So that's something that you need to research and think about as you begin to build your solution. Is how are you going to manage those secrets so that you're not bundling them into places that make them exposed to different parts of, to broader than you want them to be.
How critical is it to either keep your secrets tightly coupled with your production environment or keep them segregated? Is there any advantage, disadvantage to that? You mentioned HashiCorp. I think it's a great tool.
Right.
Any implications there? I mean, obviously there's probably administrative overhead that's involved somewhere, but from a pure security perspective, any insights there or any advantages or disadvantages?
So I think you do have to manage, you're going to want to keep your secrets broken up in by the same way you break up your environments and manage them. You really want to practice managing your secrets in dev the same way you manage them in production, even though they're separate. So you need a life cycle for creating and deploying those secrets. And because you're deploying and doing this in dev more often, you've got a lot of muscle memory. So when it comes time to make these changes in production, hopefully either you're making changes in production on a regular basis and rotating keys and so forth on a regular basis, or you've got practice from your development environments. There's and that practice, if you're doing a lot, you're going to automate it, and that's going to help you with your reliability and security in your production environments. So this is something that's just, think about the threat model and then practice to make sure that you're managing the life cycle correctly.
Yeah, when you're talking threat modeling, you're speaking my language, no question. That's a great, yes. I think not enough of it's been done, but I think part of the factor of that is that not most folks don't really have a deep understanding or subject matter expertise on how to do threat modeling or what are good best practices around that. Like there's a number of different things like the Microsoft Stride model, which is very simple, but at least get you going in the right direction. It's a great, yeah, exactly. And then you can get more advanced, of course. Thank you, Mark.
And if you reach out to your security team, they'll be happy to give you the introductory course and work with you on a threat model. And this is a great way to build, break down those silos across organizations. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, James.
Yeah, great insight, Mark. Thank you. Well, we have another great question from the audience here. Any thoughts on best ways to cost justify the transformation to containers? Are there quick wins from a cost perspective to be leveraged in this environment? So to me, this is more or less selling the transformation, from a expense capital, digital transformation perspective. Andrew, any insights on that in terms of that? Cost justifications, benefits, ROI, things of that nature.
We were in this situation lucky position because majority of our customers, they all had data centers, they had servers, they have everything. And the good thing is about the servers, their cost, it's in the books. The bill from a data center, it was clearly visible. So for us, it was very easy to do the calculations and say, okay, this is what's going to happen. Yes, because obviously, if you're dealing with hardware, you have to scale it up. You have to buy enough servers that is going to sustain your peak of calls at Christmas time. And the rest of the year, they're just like sitting there idle. So if you're just talking about computing resources, it's very easy to do, and we even had some automated calculators for that. What people don't realize, however, is it's one of my favorite fairy tales about the stone soup. So in this migration, there's always this thing involved that yes, there's going to be, you will need to add some DevOps resources here. You will need to have some security in there. You may need to change your development practices. So that's more difficult to calculate. And that's important, obviously, not to create any false expectations and saying, okay, you're going to save that much, but it's going to be, the amounts are going to be smaller by the end of the day.
Well, you call the stone soup, we call it the free puppy, I think, right? Excellent. Valentina, any insights there?
Yeah, so I think one key aspect there is to establish clear MBOs or OKRs or whatever tool the organization is using internally, right? So there's aspects of Kubernetes, as Andriy was saying, that are, or Kubernetes or containers or whatever transformation of the infrastructure that are sometimes less tangible. Developer productivity, right? So establishing MBOs that help you track and measure that, it's really critical. And then, as Andriy said, there's like low-hanging fruits, right? Finding those applications, for example, that are very ephemeral in nature, that will just naturally scale to zero, and actually moving those to, to an infrastructure that it's capable of scaling to zero. Those will be just your like easy wins that you can start banking on from the get-go.
What are some of those low-hanging fruit in terms of scaling to zero? What are the easy ones that you can think of so that they can kind of be muscle memory for some of our folks?
I'd say web servers kind of probably the easiest ones, where folks have tons of web servers fronting a bunch of other services that need to scale up or down. Those are relatively straightforward. If you have app servers that are relatively stateless, a bunch of Ruby, PHP, those kind of apps are Python relatively straightforward. If you have Django or Flask or one of those frameworks where you built your apps, those are relatively stateless, where they rely on a database for state, and those can typically scale up and down quite easily and fit well in these kind of workloads. If you have big, traditional Java monoliths, probably less so.
Yeah.
But yeah.
J2EE, yeah, definitely not.
Yeah. One thing that I'd also add to the cost story here is you have to realize that the cost play is not it's not just tied to containers alone, but there's a cloud play factor and a managed services factor that also is significant to actually realize those costs. If you can get your workloads into the cloud, they're definitely way cheaper if you do it right. And then containers really help you, back to what I was saying earlier, which is the portability of it. You want to constantly be riding the next big, wave of cost savings. If you, look at something like AWS over the last 10 years, every new instance type that they come up with is cheaper than the previous one, right? And it's at least 10 to 15% cheaper. So every year when they come up with a new instance type, you want to jump on that new instance type. You don't want to be stuck with your old hardware, still reaping the same benefits. Like now the next big wave on AWS is their Graviton 2 and Graviton 3 that they're going to come up with. They just announced the new ARM architecture that Graviton 3 is going to be based on, the Neoverse N2. And that's going to blow all the Intel x86 based machines out of the park. Graviton 2 is already showing 40% price performance boost over existing Intel CPUs, right? And so you're going to see that grow up to 60 and 70 and God knows where that'll go. But really, if you want to jump on the ARM one, you've got to be portable to start with. You can't start thinking about getting all these cost reductions if you're not portable in the first place. It's like having stones tied down to your feet. You're not going to be able to walk. So getting onto containers is generally a good idea, but the cost benefits you realize from other areas more than just, hey, I want to get on containers and that's going to unlock tons of dollars for me. That's not really where the cost savings happen.
Yeah, sure. Mark, any insights on this topic before we go to the next question?
Yes, right. And I think it's part of the container ecosystem. It's that broader view that with containers you get a portability of your applications, and you get the ability to deploy faster, which means that your developers can build in smaller increments, and this gets you, those smaller increments get you greater productivity of your developers. Because they're more portable and more contained, they end up being independent units. So now operations and your SRE teams can deal with them independently, and so they don't have to worry about, they worry less about the consequences of replacing a particular container in production, because that's already been thought through in your design. So all of these things cascade over time, and it's less an immediate return than dividends that continue to pay you back year over year. So that's what you're looking for out of this. It's not, it's not your returns tomorrow. It's not that containers are going to make you, cost less, tomorrow. It's that in the long haul, you're on a path to reap dividends from better productivities, from a better environment, from a loosely coupled architecture that gives you this ability to move rapidly and not worry if you break a few things, because you can roll back, as Andrew said, you can roll back quickly and go forward again when you figure out the right solution to a problem.
Yeah,
Thanks,
great
James.
insight. Yeah, excellent insight. Excellent insight. So I'm going to go to the next question here, and it looks like we're kind of shifting a little to the private cloud environment. So the question is, what is the best container solution should I be starting environment? And to me, there's a number of different factors I would think, based on the fact that you're even considering private cloud. Obviously, there's some preference or some mandate that needs to be accomplished there as well. But anybody want to start off with that? The best container solution for private cloud, or maybe some pitfalls or pros and cons around private cloud container adoption?
Maybe I'll start
Excellent.
here. So a couple of considerations here. One is, as James said, the best container solution for private cloud is the one that works for you, right? So it's starting from your requirements, right? And starting from, what business outcomes you're trying to achieve. And there is a variety of vendors out there that provide, container solutions. The other thing that I wanted to mention, though, is that I think at this point, from our perspective, as a container solution vendor, we see that container layer as just being table stakes, right? There's a lot of solutions out there, and for the most part, they're pretty consistent in terms of features and functionality. You probably picked through today the theme that all of us kept bringing up, which is not just about the core technology, that it's about the container orchestration and container solution. It's about everything that goes with it, right? And so it's really about finding the container solution that helps you with, all your security needs, your operational needs, your observability needs, your DevOps needs, your developer experience needs, and all the likes. All right, so and that varies a great degree between different solutions. So it's really thinking about the bigger picture of who can help you achieve your business outcomes, not just from a container layer perspective, but everything that it's needed to be successful.
Excellent. Go ahead, Mark.
Whatever container solution that you're going to use on premise, you're going to need to make sure that you can automate that, because that's where the flexibility is in deploying these things. That's what allows the developers to get their productivity is ease of deployment, but also ease of managing your clusters and your orchestration environment. You want to make sure you've got that same tool chain that you see in the cloud, that you're thinking about, how do I manage security? How do I manage logs, tracing? How do I manage, utilization? So you're going to have to think through, if you're going to do this, you need to find a partner like VMware that will give you some of this, or maybe, Nutanix or somebody that gives you the tool set so that you can manage this stuff. Because if you go it alone with installing your own Kubernetes cluster and so forth, there's a lot of things that you've got to get before you get to that level of productivity. So, just make sure you choose a partner that can help you get that full suite of things. Because if you're gonna build this up from bare bones, you're gonna spend a lot of your time building environments and not a lot of time building the systems, the business system that you want to build.
That certainly, bears well for companies that are offering this kind of Kubernetes in a box kind of offering, where they understand that the subject matter expertise is probably not up to par across the board. And I think folks innately understand, even if you try to lift and shift out of either an on-prem or a private cloud to a public cloud, there's going to be complications, or even within private cloud. So yeah, great points, Mark. Phenomenal. Okay, so we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. What I want to do is go back around, kind of the magic wand question, right? What do you foresee containerization, as a paradigm? What would you like to see it evolve to? Any other questions or any other peripheral comments that you have around this topic? So far, it's been phenomenal. But I'm going to start with Andrew. Anything else do you want to add to the discussion that we possibly didn't cover?
Well, picking up from your magic wand idea, if I had one, my wish would be to speed up the development of configuration management tools for containerization for Kubernetes for cloud. About 12 years ago, we have developed our own tool to manage configuration across the physical servers, which we have been using ever since. And now, I look at the state of things, it's pretty much like it was in the early 2000s, when you would have a whole bunch of servers, and then somebody would do manual operations. So right now it's the same thing, just people doing kubectl, but a lot of manual things, a lot of highly sophisticated, highly paid DevOps that are doing comparing text files by eyes on 2 screens. It's crazy. And it's a big task. It's a more complex task than we did years ago. So I'm sure we're not the only ones. There are other projects. So I just wish they would come to the market sooner. So we will give developers and product managers something to handle the development well, deliver it faster, and most importantly, once it's in production, don't mess up on rolling out new updates or changes.
Yeah, great. Phenomenal. Rahul, what do you say?
So in my opinion, I'm really glad that Kubernetes kind of got the traction that it did. But in reality, when I look at the number of peripheral projects that are coming up, staying up with them is almost impossible. And if you don't believe me, go to the Cloud Native Foundation page and just scroll through the list of projects. If it doesn't give you a headache, kudos to you. But keeping up with all the different vectors along which the project is evolving and the things that you need to cover is really, really hard. So I think opinionated, use case based solutions are very highly needed for the market, especially for newcomers into the space, because trying to capture that entire space to build your first solution is just too much to handle. Okay, we all believe that we design systems with all the right decision-making framework and all the right, knowledge to make all the right decisions. We don't. Right now, the vector space is just so large with all of these tools that if you were to make all the right decisions, it would take you years before you put your plan together. Right? And that's just not the way you go about doing your business. So my recommendation to everyone is start with a simple managed service that is opinionated, that doesn't do everything that everybody wants. Start with something that's closest to your use case. Okay, there are solutions, tons of solutions out there. There's ECS, there is EKS, there are VMware solutions, there's OpenShift solutions where there are prepackaged opinions about how you do something. It's not 100% of what you might want to do, but pick one of those. Stay narrow within those limits to try and solve your problem. But that would be the best way to get your feet wet with this world of containers and Kubernetes. And start deploying your apps. That would be my first advice. And as you grow in confidence around all the things that work or don't work for you, use that learning to redesign your platform that you want to be on, or to switch your platforms to something else that gives you a little more flexibility. Do not start ever with a bare Kubernetes cluster is my recommendation. From all my years of learning, I've been doing Kubernetes now for, I think, ever since Kubernetes project started, or even Docker, in fact. And I'm closely knit with all of those teams. But I would recommend not starting with that base cluster ever.
Yeah, as tempting as it looks and as easy as it seems, it's not a good idea. No question. No, thanks, Rahul. Valentina, any closing remarks?
Maybe my magic wand would be, that it's not just easy to bring up a Kubernetes cluster from one of those, managed or on-prem solutions, but I wish we can give solutions where it's easy to bring everything that developers and DevOps need to make it successful. So, my aim and goal and wish is that we get to a place where, like in a few seconds, you have a full stack available for you on top of Kubernetes.
Yeah, same here. Great. Mark, bring us home. What do you got?
So I would say two things. One, leverage what Rahul said, iterate. So experiment, iterate. The other thing is be open to new opinions. So this is, it's very different than your legacy on-prem environment. So when you pick an opinionated framework, you don't have to pick one that's got exactly the same opinions as you. Be open to some of these other opinions, because there's value in the learning that's been done over the past 5 to 10 years in container environments. So open yourself up to new paradigms and iterate as quickly as possible. Thank you, James.
Thank you all. I mean, we were right at the top of the hour, maybe 20 seconds before. This is perfect timing, everybody, and some great conversations. So, Max, do you have any final words before we break today?
Yeah, it was amazing. Thanks so much for that, guys. Definitely some tactical insight that our audience can implement in their own roles. So yeah, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you guys. I know you're all super busy, so we do genuinely appreciate you joining us and sharing your insight. For our audience, the video was recorded, so we'll be sending that out to you tomorrow, so you can watch it on demand and share it as you please. And finally, a thanks to DevGraph as well. They partnered up with us to make this one possible, so we appreciate them, and if you haven't, go and check them out. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in, and thanks again to our speakers.
Great job, everybody, and take care. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.